Many people, have asked me why the name Cusp Years. While I was researching for the book, I was struggling with the title. I didn't want to use the name of the book, which has something like the medieval history of India or the Islamic invasion of India. These titles were too simplistic and honestly did not bring out the emotions I wanted in the book. So the more I researched, the more I realized that the period of around 500 years of immense significance from not just a military and political point of view. In some ways, the invasions put the social structure of India on a path of irreversible change. The Indian society before the invasion and the Indian society after the establishment of Delhi Sultanate were so different that the 500 years became a time bridge between the two periods. That's when I decided to call the book The Cusp Years, because it sort of brings together two different parts of our history. There is a very narrow, sort of a Marxist view of history that has been taught to us. And that was the reason why this book became so important for me. Take, for example, the BA Honors History syllabus of Delhi University. Part of the syllabus covers the period between 350 BC and 750 CE, and then from 750 to 1206 CE in two parts. The first part totally misses the early Islamic invasions starting early 6th century. The second part starts with the conquest of Sindh and jumps to Turkish invasions, missing out an entire period of almost 300 years between them. Even in the accounts of conquest of Sindh, the focus is not on actual resistance offered by the Hindu kings, but it's on their weaknesses. In one of the suggested readings, it's called The Comprehensive History of India, Volume 4 by R.S. Sharma. The stress is on how easily the Turks defeated Hindu Shahi kings. The truth, however, is very different. And these are the kind of contents like which Mr. R.S. Sharma's book makes. It looks as if the Turks were some kind of magicians who arrived in India, defeated the Hindu Shahis, and established their own rule. Minor rulers like Yaqub bin Layth, who was the head of a very short-lived Safarid dynasty, has been projected as a great warrior. Sharma does not mention the details of the defeats the Islamic army suffered. The victory of Muslim invaders came after almost 500 years of consistent failures. While the Arabs captured all of Iran, West Asia, North Africa, and Spain in, say, less than 100 years, it took them more than 500 years for them to even establish an administrative setup in India. That is, that's a stark difference between their conquest of the other places and India.
Namaste and welcome to another episode of Indic Talks. I am Ujasvi Mishra and today we will be talking about the 500 years of Hindu resistance. We have our speaker today who is Vijender Sharma ji. He is an entrepreneur and history enthusiast. He has authored two books on the lesser known aspects of Indian history. His first book was Essays on Indic History. He published his second book, The Cusp Years, 500 Years of Hindu Resistance, earlier this year. Often in our mainstream history, writing, and academia, the Islamic invasion of India is shown as a relatively simple affair, where the invaders defeated the Hindu kings, established Delhi Sultanate, and that was it. However, the 500-year-long stiff resistance offered by Hindus is either ignored or is mentioned in passing. My attempt through this book is to bring out the lesser-known facts of Hindu resistance, is what our speaker has said to us today. And with much excitement, sir, I welcome you and I request you to take over from here.
Thank you, Jasvi. Namaste, everyone. I'm Vijender Sharma, and I will be talking about my new book, the Cusp Years, 500 years of Hindu resistance. Well, before I start, I would like to thank Indic Talks for giving me the opportunity and the platform for sharing my thoughts. I also thank Ojasvi for coordinating and making this talk possible. I hope that everyone will like this session. So I will start with the basic question: what is the book about, and what are the broad contours that I touched upon in this book? So something Ojasvi has already given you a brief outline, but the book touches upon the period of more than 500 years between the first Islamic invasion of India and the founding of the Delhi Sultanate. So it talks about the political and social conditions of India on the eve of Islamic invasion and how the initial invasions were successfully repelled by the Hindus and the Buddhist kings of India, something that our history books overlook. I have divided the invasions into two sections. The first section talks about the frontier kingdoms, which faced the brunt of the invasion in early decades and centuries. The second being the kingdoms of the hinterland, which, though shielded from the initial attacks, did eventually face the invading forces and defeated them. So, the Islamic invasion of India proved to be a long drawn catastrophic event, despite the resistance offered by the Indian kings. The invasions brought with them adverse changes to the social, political, religious, and demographic changes to India. Some of these changes were so traumatic that we feel their impact even after almost 1400 years. The book also dispels a lot of Marxist myths, like the invasion of India was a quick and easy process, and that the Sufis of medieval India were some kind of mellow spiritual leaders whose enlightened thoughts converted lakhs of Hindus to Islam. So these are the very common sort of myths that we read in our textbook. I have tried to collate information on how the Islamic invasion introduced social evils like slavery and forced genital mutilation of children, which were unknown to the Indic society before. These two evils in particular led to millions of Indians losing their identity, property, free will, and even life at the hands of the invaders. The invasion also led to, I would say, a total decline of several traditional Indian art forms like sculpting, painting, temple building, and so on. So, further in the talk, I will take up all these issues in detail and will try to see the larger picture. We will see how this everything comes together. Which the Islamic invasion of India sort of painted on the canvas of medieval India. These changes, these drastic changes. Many people, have asked me why the name Cusp Years. While I was researching for the book, I was struggling with the title. I didn't want to use the name of the book, which has something like the medieval history of India or the Islamic invasion of India. These titles were too simplistic and honestly did not bring out the emotions I wanted in the book. So the more I researched, the more I realized that the period of around 500 years of immense significance from not just a military and political point of view. In some ways, the invasions put the social structure of India on a path of irreversible change. The Indian society before the invasion and the Indian society after the establishment of Delhi Sultanate were so different that the 500 years became a time bridge between the two periods. That's when I decided to call the book The Cusp Years, because it sort of brings together two different parts of our history. The title aptly describes the time period, of monumental changes at a glacial pace, which changed Indian history forever. The changes during the cusp years of Indian history have had not been talked about in our mainstream academia. There is a very narrow sort of a Marxist view of history that has been taught to us, and that was the reason why this book became so important for me. Take for example the BA honors history syllabus of Delhi University. Part of the syllabus covers the period between 350 BC and 750 CE, and then from 750 to 1206 CE in two parts. The first part totally misses the early Islamic invasions starting early 6th century. The second part starts with the conquest of Sindh and jumps to Turkish invasions, missing out an entire period of almost 300 years between them. Even in the accounts of conquest of Sindh, the focus is not on actual resistance offered by the Hindu kings, but it's on their weaknesses. In one of the suggested readings, it's called "The Comprehensive History of India," Volume 4 by R. S. Sharma. The stress is on how easily the Turks defeated Hindu Shahi kings. The truth, however, is very different. And these are the kind of contents like which Mr. R. S. Sharma's book makes. It looks as if the Turks were some kind of magicians who arrived in India, defeated the Hindu Shahis, and established their own rule. Minor rulers like Yaqub bin Layth, who was the head of a very short-lived Safarid dynasty, has been projected as a great warrior. Sharma does not mention the details of the defeats the Islamic army suffered at the hands of not just the Shahis, but Indian kings before them. So he carefully picked two relatively successful Turkish rulers, Muhammad Ghazni and Muhammad Ghori, to make his point. Now, even in this selective approach, R.S. Sharma mentions the religious persecution and social oppression of Indians in passing. He doesn't give much of a weightage to that. His entire focus is on defeat of Indian kings at the hands of the Turkish invaders. Though the account is well cited, it leaves a huge gap in history writing. The students have no idea what the Hindu Shahis or the Turk Shahis, who patronized both Buddhism and Hinduism, did to defend and repel the Islamic invasions. The students do not know who these rulers were, what was their stand on social and religious matters, what did they do to protect India from the Islamic invasions. They know nothing about it. The only thing they get to know from Sharma's book is that they were easily defeated by the Turks in a few decades. And that is, of course, not the truth. Now, apart from the information being withheld by the likes of R.S. Sharma, the students are given an impression that successful Islamic invasion of India happened in a short span of time, where the Islamic invaders defeated the weak Indian or Hindu kingdoms. Sharma, no, he fails to put things in context by telling the students that the victory of Muslim invaders came after almost 500 years of consistent failures. While the Arabs captured all of Iran, West Asia, North Africa, and Spain in, say, less than 100 years, it took them more than 500 years for them to even establish an administrative setup in India. So that is, that's a stark difference between their conquest of the other places and India. Now, Sharma also fails to inform the students about the inhuman practice of slave taking by the Arabs and later by the Turks from among the Hindus. He does not mention slavery. He does mention slavery, but as a very matter of fact way, without explaining what it meant and what was its impact on the society. Historians also fail to inform the readers that India was the most dangerous frontier of the Islamic invasions, which stood like a mighty wall between the forces of Islam and Indic religions for almost 500 years. Now, it is the omissions like these that prompted me to research and come up with this book. I would say that this book is everything that is missing from the academic work and in popular history writing. So, one of the most important tasks of history writing is to dispel popular misconceptions. As I mentioned before, the current reading of early medieval history of India will make one believe that Ghazni and Bori attacked India and established the Muslim rule. The truth is that it took the invaders, as I said, no more than 500 years to establish their first administration. So in my book, I have cited various references which attest to the fact. For example, Blankenship, an American historian, he writes in one of his works, and I quote, apparently the first front of the Islamic invasions to suffer a breakdown as complete as it was catastrophic was India, recently the scene of the Umayyad Caliphate's latest and last success. He writes it after the defeat in Sindh. Here he is referring to the disastrous defeat of the Arabs at the hands of the king of Zabul. This was early on during the Islamic invasions. There was a reason why the Arabs who conquered vast swathes of land from Arabia to Morocco and Spain in west and Iran in east in less than a century, as I said, could not capture India. It was not as if the Arabs had a poorly trained army or the terrain was particularly difficult in India. After all, they had taken over deserts and plains of North Africa. They had captured Spain across the Straits of Gibraltar and crossed snowy mountains to reach the Persian plateau. So, what exactly stopped them from taking over India in a span of few decades? I mean, this is the question that we should be asking, and there should be answers. Apart from the reasons like infighting among the Arabs, there was a lot of infighting happening even during the Caliphate days. The primary reason, according to me, for the Islamic invasion to halt at the gates of India was the strong resistance offered by the Hindu and Buddhist kings of India. The frontier states had powerful kings with highly trained army, which was ruthless, which had protected the Indian frontiers for centuries. Some of them were invaders like the Tukshais, they came from Central Asia. They were ruthless and fought bravely to defend their territories. When the Arabs mounted at least two large-scale attacks on India using their best armies. The idea was to subdue India for good and establish the rule of Islam. It's been always the case, the prime motivation for the invasions. Both these attacks failed miserably. The first attempt was made in 698 CE when Hajjaz, the Arab governor of Iraq, called upon the services of the Arab army to extract tribute from the Tukshais. The army was named the Army of Annihilation, or Jaish al-Fana. The Hajjaj's explicit orders were to lay waste the Turk Shahi territories and enslave survivors. The commander of the army, Ubaidullah, he recruited many local Arab soldiers on his way to India from Baghdad by invoking the sentiments of jihad. The time does not permit me to go into the spectacular victory of the Turk Shahis, but for now, I will say that at the battle, the Turk Shahis successfully, they using this strategy, tricked the Arabs into a narrow pass and eventually killed almost all the troops, save for a few. Now, the people who are fleeing, the soldiers who are fleeing away, humiliated and defeated, they started retreating to a base in Afghanistan, but they were struck by food and fodder shortage. It's believed that they have killed and eaten dying horses to survive, and such was the dire situation. When an even smaller contingent of soldiers arrived at the base, because most of them died of starvation, a lot of them died of overeating when food was given to them. It was such an embarrassing defeat for the Arabs. So the army of annihilation was virtually annihilated by the Turk Shahis. We don't get to read this in our history books. The next attempt was made the following year. This time, Hajjaz, the governor, called upon the services of a professional army called the Peacock Army. Now, this was named so because of their flamboyant uniforms and was considered to be the deadliest Arab army. The Peacock Army was sent to India to fight Turk Shahis to avenge the defeat of the Army of Annihilation. However, the professional army was terrified by the fate suffered by the Army of Annihilation the year before, and it witnessed a mutiny. A large section of the army refused to fight the Turk Shahis. They made peace with Zunbil, the king of Turk Shahis, and offered tribute in return of a safe passage. Now, there are some of the instances that show us, like these two, that the real picture of Islamic invasions on India was very different from what we read about. Not only did the invaders suffer defeats, they were thoroughly humiliated by the Indian forces. These major events are not covered in the history textbooks. At best, they are covered in a single line in a very generic manner, like R.S. Sharma does, that some defeats were suffered by the Arabs or the invaders. And in some kind of these defeats are documented by Islamic historians and chroniclers. I mean, it's not something which is being made up, but there seemed to be a coordinated attempt at withholding history by the Marxist historians. I mean, why else would historians withhold this information? The other things, like the other kind of spin that they create on the Islamic invasion of India, is like for the pure territorial gains as the motive. Romila Thapar has more than one occasion has tried to pass off the invasions of Ghazni and Ghori as motivation for loot and nothing to do with religion. She, in fact, goes on to draw a false equivalence to justify her claims. I have covered this in one chapter on Somnath. Readers can go through that, where she says that since Ghazni invaded and looted non-Sunni Muslim rulers, hence he can't be labeled as particularly anti-Hindu, since he was also attacking non-Sunnis. Now, what she hides from the reader is the fact that Sunni rulers like Ghazni, for them, all non-Sunni sects were just as bad as the idolatrous Hindus. The fact that Ghazni never destroyed Sunni mosques tells us that his motivation for desecration of temples was indeed religious and not monetary, as she wants her readers to believe, or students who read her books to believe. Other rulers, I mentioned Yaqub bin Layth, a minor Safarid ruler who mounted regular attacks on India. And he explicitly says that his motivation was to mount Ghazwa. It's a kind of a holy war on India. The Ghazwa wars are still popular fantasy in Pakistan, where a vast majority of the population keeps planning one on India. That's why Hind. Again, quoting Blankenship, he in his book, The End of Jihad State, says that the imperative of caliphate was to establish God's rule. That is Islamic rule on earth through armed struggle. He further says that such struggles came to be known as jihad, and such jihad remained the salient policy of the caliphate. Now, there are people who are quoting original texts and first-hand reports, while our historians are doing something very differently. So to say that these invasions were purely motivated by the lure of money and treasure is a lie that has been perfected by the Marxist historians of India. The other aspect of Islamic invasion, which reinforces the fact that the attacks were religiously motivated, comes from the mass conversion of Hindus and Buddhists after the Islamic invasion. So after every invasion or every attack. However, these early conversions were not entirely successful. We have an account of a Korean monk, He Cho, who visited India a decade after the capture of Sindh by Bin Qasim. He writes that both Hindus and Buddhists were practicing their own religion in Sindh. This clearly shows that the conversion did not last long, and people reverted to their original religion as at the first opportunity they got. So the situation was same with people in Punjab and Afghanistan. We keep on reading about revolts and rebellions and people going back to their religion. This shows that not only did the Hindu rulers mounted a stiff resistance, against the Islamic invasion, but the common people too resisted the conversion attempts. We read about repeated revolts and mutinies and cases of apostasy as late as 11th century in Afghanistan. This is yet again, it shows that the religious motivations were very much a part of Islamic invasion of India. The forced conversion of captured population is a dead giveaway of the religious motives of the invasions. Now, apart from religiously motivated wars and destruction of temples, the Islamic invasion also led to catastrophic social changes, right, as I mentioned before. These changes were in some way bigger and long lasting than the occupation of territories by the Islamic forces. The territories kept changing hands and getting expanded, contracted, foreign forces coming in, but social changes, stayed on. So in my book, I have talked about this in detail. The immediate change that was witnessed was the decline of art and science in northwestern India, which was like the bed of invasion. The Islamic invasion and the subsequent attempt of administrative units in parts of Afghanistan and northern Punjab led to persecution of the social elites. These were primarily the artists and the Brahmins. The immediate result of an Islamic invasion was almost always destruction of temples and monasteries. This meant that people depending on these places were first to be impacted. A temple or a monastery was a source of income for hundreds of artists who were employed to build, expand, and decorate these places. It's an ongoing process. Now, the Islamic invaders saw idolatry as a biggest sin, and hence the temple and monasteries were to be destroyed. And this rendered the artists jobless. Such was the impact of this that there was a Tibetan monk, Taranat, who visited India in late 16th century. He observed that the art of sculpting and painting has disappeared from places where the Muslims ruled. He observed that the art of image making survives only in southern India. And this is also the case even today. So, the northern India was also the region which, the southern India was also the region which relatively free from Islamic invasion. So even today, northern India, the artists lack the skill of sculpting or painting as compared to the artists in southern India. The other class of social elites that suffered the most were, again, the Brahmins, who were not only the priests, but also great scholars and scientists. Al-Biruni, who stayed in India in the early 11th century, found it extremely difficult to contact a scholar in the regions captured by Ghazni. He said that the large-scale destruction caused by Ghazni was the reason that Hindu science has retired from the regions of Punjab and can now be found in faraway places like Kashmir and Banaras, which means the people had fled those places. He also recorded that the Hindu scholars were extremely antagonistic to the foreigners, and that is the Muslims, foreigners when we say Muslims, because the destruction caused by them. So it was like a logical thing for Indians to do. The Hindus of India witnessed such widespread bigotry for the first time in their history. I mean, India has been invaded multiple times since the invasion of Alexander. But each time, the invader eventually assimilated in the Indian society by adopting their language, culture, and religion of India. The Indo-Greeks, for example, became Buddhists, and they also patronized Hindu gods. The Kushans took Indian names and adopted Indian languages for their administration. They even patronized Indian religions, Buddhism and Hinduism. At one point, they became completely Indian, forgetting their original culture. There was nothing to distinguish them from other Indians. The situation, however, was very different with the Islamic invasions. Not only did the invaders occupy territory, they also imposed their own language, culture, and religion on the people they captured. They also saw the non-Muslim Indians as the other, and tried to enforce their own religion on them in hope to convert them. The othering of Hindus and non-Muslims contributed to social changes, and it continued well into the modern times. And India was partitioned on religious lines in 1947, as yeah, so India was partitioned on religious lines in 1947. As recent as 1990s, the Kashmiri Hindus were othered and cleansed from the valley. They still can't go back. So, talking about the atrocities on Indians at the hands of Islamic invaders, one cannot leave out, the most heinous of the atrocities, that's of slavery. Just like religious bigotry of the invaders, slavery was an alien concept for Indians. More so enslaving of the civilian population. The invaders came with a religious sanction of slave taking, and they used it to traumatize the common people of India. The most startling aspect of slavery was the indiscriminate approach of the Islamic invaders, who made no distinction between men, women, and children. So everyone was a fair game for them. There was a demand for all kinds of slaves in the markets of Central Asia, which was being occupied by the Islamic forces by that time. Historians do mention slavery in early medieval and medieval India, but that is just a footnote, or at best presented as a matter of fact information. Some historians also sort of give it a economic color by saying that Khilji introduced market reforms by fixing the prices of slaves. Um, so the but none of them tells us about the process, the risks, and the conditions in which the slaves were transported. So we know people were captured as slaves, but what happened to them? How were they sold? Where were they sold? So I have tried to somehow recreate the events which will help us appreciate the trauma the slaves went through. The northern region of medieval India, which forms the modern states of Pakistan and Afghanistan, were most abused hunting grounds of the Islamic invaders. Many raids and attacks that India witnessed since early 7th century resulted in slave taking. The magnitude of slave taking was different in each attack, and it depended on how successful the attack or the raid was. There was one consistent act in all these raids, and that was slave taking. So it doesn't matter whether you win or lose, they ended up taking slaves, sometimes a handful, sometimes a lot. Let's not forget that the invasions happened with religious sanction of loot and slave taking. You know, everyone was a fair game when it came to slave taking. Women and children too were enslaved. Once they were enslaved, the men and women would be taken to the markets in Central Asia to be sold. So, imagine an attack in, say, Multan, where invaders managed to take, let us assume, 1,000 slaves. How will these 1,000 people be sent to Bukhara to be sold? They need to be transported. The enslaved Hindus were most likely made to march on foot from Multan to Bukhara, much like how the Nazis made the Jews march from a detention center to a concentration camp. It was just like many Jews died on the way because of hunger, exhaustion, or even severe weather conditions. The enslaved Hindus too would have died on their way to Bukhara when they were obviously not provided horses or wagons. It is likely that they were not fed properly, nor were they given adequate clothing. The mortality rates of slaves during the months long journey must have been really high. There are no exact figures, but one can assume. There are no, this will not be, let's say, when we say we can assume conservatively, we say 50% of the slave caravan perished by the time they reached their destination. So out of 1,000 unfortunate people who started their journey from Multan, only 500 would have reached Bukhara. Well, other than slavery, or I'd say as a subset of slavery, the worst form was child slavery. And when I say child slavery, I really mean castration of children, mostly prepubescent boys who were either captured, kidnapped, or stolen, even from their homes, not just on a battlefield, but from their home, and sold into slavery. So these children captured were castrated by either crushing their testicles or by cutting off the entire genital organ. Now, when I say the children were castrated, one must remember that we're talking about a time period when anesthesia was unknown. And the only thing used to numb the pain was probably opium. So they were drugging the children for the procedure. And, it was extremely painful and had a very, very high mortality risk due to post-procedure complications. It can be infections, can be excessive bleeding. Scholars believe, and I have quoted that in my book, that the mortality rates for forced castration were as high as 80%. Some medieval records suggest that the Muslim rulers in India, also abroad, have maintained thousands of castrated slaves in their harem. 100 castrated boys would produce 20 eunuch slaves. Now you can imagine how many boys would have been captured and castrated to maintain thousands of castrated slaves. For again, let's take an example. The child slavers would have to capture and castrate at least 250,000 boys to ensure the Sultan has 50,000 eunuchs under him. And that is the kind of barbarity we are talking about. And it started with the advent of Islam in India, and it continued well into the Mughal times. It was only in the 17th century that slavery was banned by a royal decree of Shivaji Maharaj in his territories. It was not the British who banned slavery. And a handful of these castrated slaves rose to the rank of higher ranks and occupied higher positions. The Marxist historians and the modern day gender activists have taken these aberrations to assert that slaves and trans people were rewarded during the Islamic rule. They hide the fact that all of these, the so-called gender fluid or trans people, were forcefully castrated to serve the royal family. These eunuchs went through severe trauma in their childhood well before they could reach the age of consent. Now, as usual, the Marxist historians lie to propagate their ideology of glorifying the invaders. There's nothing glorious in what we read about the slave kings or the slave generals. Another lie that these people propagate is the wars between Hindus and Buddhists. Where the evil Hindus killed the Buddhists and destroyed Buddhism in India. And they say this despite the copious evidence to the contrary. We had Hindu kings and even ordinary Hindus patronizing Buddhism since its inception. Even in 11th century, when Biruni was in India, Hindus and Buddhists sort of coexisted peacefully. In fact, Biruni, he was shocked to see that the theological and philosophical differences in India were handled with debates instead of sword, like it used to happen in his territories. He writes that Buddhists cordially hate the Brahmins. Brahmins is a generic term for Hindus. He suggests that there were theological differences between the Buddhists and Hindus, but they were still cordial to each other. But where does this notion of the animosity between Hindus and Buddhists come from? It's a very interesting thing that I noticed during research. Like the Aryan invasion theory, the concept of a great Buddhist and Hindu divide is a creation of the white Christian scholars. John Marshall happened to excavate two skeletons at the Dharmarajika Stupa in Takshashila. Once the skeletons were revealed, based on their position, he promptly identified them as two warring people. One being a Buddhist and the other being a Hindu, where the Hindu has killed the Buddhist. So this imaginary hypothesis was then supported by others like Oral Stein. There was back then there was no way to ascertain even the age of the skeleton. They might not be ancient skeletons. The radiocarbon dating was invented only in late 40s. In absence of any credible evidence, the false hypothesis continued to be accepted. The Marxists further did because they saw the majority Hindus as the oppressors. This is the reason the Marxists always portray the minority as the oppressed so that they can blame the majority. They have to find an oppressor and an oppressed to further their ideology. So, the global left academia even created sort of a false Islamic golden age to glorify the oppressed. The Islamic golden age was, in fact, a mega translation project where the Arab and Persian translators went about translating mostly the Greek and Sanskrit works on mathematics, science, and medicine into Arabic. So, in my book, I have explained in detail the motivation and methodology of these translations. I have also explained how none of these terms like father of algebra and father of medicine given to these so-called polymaths don't really have any evidence to support the claims. In fact, the first hospital in the caliphate came almost 500 years after their existence were recorded in India. And 200 years before Avicenna, the so-called father of medicine, was even born. So, Fakshian talks about publicly funded hospitals in India, which were free for everyone. In essence, there was, nothing golden about these Islamic golden age. It was simply a translation project, which was meant to satisfy the ego of the caliphate. In the end, I would briefly touch upon the reasons for eventual success of Islamic invaders in occupying India. Uh, Many scholars have attributed reasons for the eventual defeat of Hindus at the hands of the Islamic invaders with various reasons. They range from weak military, lack of modern military strategy, superior cavalry of Muslims or the Turks because they were Central Asian and they had this tradition of being very agile on a horse, and also on the outdated code of war of Hindus. And while these have been the reasons for defeat, the single most important reason for Islamic victory, according to me, was the sheer perseverance of the Islamic forces. The attack started in early 7th century and continued till 1206 when the Delhi Sultanate was established. This spanned a period of little more than 500 years. During these 500 years, Islamic invaders came from Arabia, Persia, and Central Asia, constantly attacking India. They suffered losses, but they kept attacking. They never gave up. They kept attacking till they confronted that one weaker king who could be defeated. They always looked for that opportunity. They carved out Indian territories one piece at a time till they reached the heart of India. Another reason, according to me, which could have slightly lesser impact, was the defensive approach of Indian kings. So the Hindu kings never went into the enemy territory to mount an offense. They always fought a defensive war to protect their own territory. The invaders, on the other hand, they risked the loss of their own territory to capture India. I mean, we can debate the motivations or the lack of it for such behavior, but these are the reasons I think led to the eventual capture of India. And with this, I would end my talk here and open up the discussion for questions.
Thank you very much, sir, for providing that summary of the book. We'll dive into the question and answer session now. One thing that oftentimes is a myth that is often required to be busted when we talk about the invasions, especially the Islamic invasions, is that people often say that it couldn't have been an invasion against India because India wasn't a country and there was no collective national identity. Now, oftentimes people, mention the in wars that were happening. A lot of times they mention, historians who have said that there was a lack of maps and properly understanding the Cartesian absolutism that needs to be understood as this being Akhand Bharat. So I would like you to bust that myth.
See, the point where we say India came into being in 1947. There are a lot of funny ways in which people have sort of, debunked this. Like In 1600, there was this British sort of company which was incorporated, was called the East India Company. Why wasn't it called the East South Asia Company? Or, because India as a concept existed not only in 1600, but much before that. We have been, the Persians have called us Hind. They never said, Kashmir or the Central Plateau or the Deccan Plateau. They never identified us through our geographical differences. They identified us as a unit, which was India or Hind. Always, it was always like that. Even during early historic times, we have Indica, the Greek account. It's called Indica for a reason. So the area was identified as a unit, which can be because of different things. Now we, as today, understand the definition of a nation state is very different from how nation were identified or defined earlier. I mean, we can today in 2024 create another definition of nation, which might not recognize any of these countries today as a single unit. So it really depends on what we see as a country. What do we define a nation as? Is religion a common factor? Is language a common factor? Is the social structure a common factor? So rather than say busting it, I would say that this is what we, when people say India did not exist, is sort of an ignorance that they are showing us. They are defining a 5,000-year-old, or they're trying to define a 5,000-year-old civilization based on a definition which is a 20th century creation. So there's absolutely no way you can define something as old as the Indian culture, the Indian civilization, based on some Western construct of a nation state. I mean, what does Europe understand about our culture, our society? They don't understand us. I mean, they never understood in the 200-year-old period they were colonizing us. They don't understand us now. So we can't take on blindly the explanations and definitions, forced on us by a European. Just like we can't define what Europe is. I mean, who can define what Europe is? There are so many subparts in Europe. There's EU, there is EFTA. I mean, there's so many things. Like, there's no single definition to say this is Europe or this defines Europe. So I think it's very childish to say that India came into existence in 1947, because then what were the freedom fighters fighting for, if not for India?
So one of the questions that often comes to mind is there seems to be a certain cultural attachment that and a very inaccurate one that certain Muslim elements in India tend to have with the Islamic invaders. Oftentimes you can hear them having constructive discussions, when they're evaluating the downfall of the Muslim community and why they are not able to make it into the higher stratas of income. They often say that, that there was a time that we used to be the ruling class, and because of our absolutism and because of our, unopenness to new knowledge, unlike the Hindus, we have fallen short and we have come down from the ruling class. So while maybe the analysis is accurate, that connection that the ruling class of the invaders were in fact the Muslims of India, it's very important, I think, that we make sure that that is a segregation we can make.
Sorry, I didn't get the question that you're asking.
The question is that would it be right for the Muslim community to have a sentimental attachment to the invaders and saying that there was a time that the Muslims were the ruling class of India?
See, there are two parts I would like to answer this question in. So, yes, of course, I mean, we can't deny that for a very long period, majority of India was ruled by Islamic forces. Right? They had their own rules, etc., etc. But things changed when the British started colonizing us, and the territories went away. India was divided between princely states and the crown territories. And there was a further change in 1947 when the partition happened. Now, we can't deny history. Yes, there was Muslim rule, but in context of today's Muslims, even I can't give you statistics offhand, but it's there to see. There's a very stark difference between the socio-economic conditions of Muslims in northern India and in southern India, even in western India. Now, the thing is, this kind of thinking comes in when you want to justify something. So now we see in northern India, like UP and Bihar, mostly, the socio-economic conditions of Muslims is very different from the Muslims of other parts, even in Bengal, for example. Now, there is a reason why this has happened. When the elections of 1946 were happening, which was in a way a referendum on partition of India, and we had communal award where the Muslims majority seats were only contested by Muslim candidates, and in those places, Muslim League won. And back then, not everybody could vote. It was not universal. Voting was not universal, and there were strict parameters on who could vote. Mostly the elite of the society voted, and they voted for Pakistan. And when the partition happened, a large section of that elite society went to either East Pakistan or West Pakistan. So people who were left behind, or the people who did not want to go for various reasons. I mean, there's another discussion as to why people voted for Pakistan and still remained in India. But they were mostly poor, and that's how they remained. And because of the orthodoxy, yes, in a way we can say, because the likes of Devan, who want to create a stranglehold on them, they don't want them to get attached to the mainstream. They don't want them to get into formal education system. And people who escape that, they do well. I mean, we see on social media, we see in cinemas, in other sections, the Muslims are doing well. It's not that everybody is living in a slum or is poor. So we have to, I mean, this is a very different debate as to what can be done, but the perception, I think, is coming from the point of view of justifying or finding a reason as to why it is like that. Those reasons may not be correct, but that is what people are doing. That oh, we were once upon a time, we were this, but something happened, or there was some fault in us, or some fault in the government, in history, that we ended up being where we are. So yeah, I think there is some amount of truth to it, but they have to do a lot of introspection and find out the reasons. They can't simply say that we were persecuted or we were oppressed. I mean, these are these are motherhood statements. I mean, anybody can say this thing, but what are they doing to address them? I mean, the government can form committees and recommendation, but that's not going to help them. We see around us, from birth rates to education. I mean, the fertility rates are so high among the Muslims. So it eventually boils down to how much you can provide your family, as a breadwinner, to take you out of poverty, for example. I mean, government schemes can only do so much. So there's a lot of introspection that has to be done.
So, sir, like in the case of the Khilafat movement and the kind of support it enjoyed from the Indian Muslims. Now, the Caliphate was one of the primary funders of Ghazwa-e-Hind, which then was what caused most of the Islamic invasion that India witnessed. How do I, as an Indian Muslim, find myself supporting the Khilafat movement, or making sure that the downfall of the Ottoman doesn't happen, when it was the same system that had funded the Ghazwa-e-Hind, which caused much of the massacre and the pillage that India saw?
Um, See, the Khilafat movement of the early 1900s, it was a social necessity of that time. I am not justifying it. I'm just saying that the Congress of that time, they saw that the Muslims are not on board with the freedom struggle. and they wanted to do something about it because I think the population was almost 25% Muslim of undivided India. It's a large, substantial chunk, and as you said, that they still think about the old glorious days. It was the same back then because they've lost the last Mughal emperor was exiled not so long ago, and the memories were fresh. It was even living memories. People were alive who saw that. So for them to, and of course, always the religious sentiments, the orthodoxy was ingrained in the Muslim society, and the caliphate that existed in early 1900s was nothing like what existed in early 6th century. It was just in Greece, in Turkey, there was this self-appointed caliph. With no religious authority whatsoever. So it was just a sentiment to whip up the support of Muslims, which I think was a very bad idea in retrospect, because that sort of engraves the identity politics of against the dividing between the society between Hindus and Muslims. That is what it eventually did. And that in a way was also a reinforcement that listen, you are Muslims, you are different from us, you don't find common cause with our struggle, so hence here is something from my side to get your attention, which reinforces the belief that we are two different people. So today again, given our history education, which is so garbled and it's so unclear and with so many faults and so many withholding of information as we discussed, it doesn't give you the actual picture of what really happened. And once you hide history from people, you can't expect them to find a common cause or do reconciliation. So, today when the Muslims say, when I'm talking about politicians, we say, there's so many statements from Owaisi to everybody else. They keep saying 800 years, humne Raj kiya. What is this nonsense? Like you in 2024 or 2022 have nothing to do with those people. I mean, you are inviting trouble for yourself by associating yourself with a tyrant like Aurangzeb or Tipu Sultan. Why do you want to do that? There's no glory in that. You are living in the society today, so you have to find ways and means to integrate in the society you're living in. But I'll give you an example from my book. I spoke about Beruni. So he also sort of mentions that the Hindus are so different from us in terms of everything, from religion, language, everything. So, and of course, idolatry was something which divided the Hindus from the Muslims, which was something like not reconcilable at all. So that othering had started back then and it continued. So even we say that Jinnah gave us the two nation theory or Syed Ahmad Khan gave us two nation theory, but they did not give us the two nation theory. They simply reinforced and reinstated what they have been believing for a very, very long time. So, we have instances where letters were written to Abdali to come to India and, in the name of jihad and attack India, because they did not think that it's, Hindus are good enough to be, citizens of India, or they did not think they can coexist with us. So that is the problem, and this orthodoxy keeps on going. They keep sort of reinforcing this at every moment.
So when you talked about, how oppression has been often used as a means of justification, another thing that sort of, unifies people or two communities on the basis of the oppression that they've seen, although have been of very different nature, is the lower caste Hindus, as we call them. but they have played a very significant role in the resistance that we're talking about, in the Hindu resistance that we're talking about. I mean, one of the ones that have actually been recounted enough times and have sort of enjoyed some popularity among masses is the Battle of Bahraj. But can you recount some more instances that sort of makes it a little more concrete, the kind of contribution that the lower caste Hindus had in the Hindu resistance that India has seen?
See, yes. What I will instead of recounting instances, I'll give you a sort of a logical approach to look at it. So when we know that there was a very stiff resistance, not only from the kings, their armies, but also from common people. Like we see that people go back to their own religion, you know. So if we take the demography of India today, the so-called upper caste or the Savarnas are a very small portion of the entire population. It has always been like that. There was never a situation where the Savarnas became sort of a dominant section of the society. They were always a minority. Now, if a society has to mount a resistance, if the society as a whole decides to resist the conversions, or so it cannot happen if a substantial majority of the population is not with that cause. So we can't imagine any resistance against anything if the lower caste or OBCs in today's definition don't come together. So the Kshatriyas or the Brahmins or the Vaishya, they were a very small section of the society. They can't do anything if the lower castes are not with them. And so I would say that be it the freedom struggle, be it the struggle against the Muslim rulers, the non-Savarna section of the society had the biggest role, in resistance. Without them, there is nothing is going to happen without them, and that's probably also the reason why, even in today's politics, if you see, uh, every party, irrespective of the colors, they all try to sort of come up with schemes and promotional offers and everything for the non-Savarna section. Of course, they deserve it and they require it of social economic conditions or whatever. But what I'm trying to say is that they are a substantial part of decision making and they cannot be ignored. And that's why political parties go after them the way they do. So, I don't want to recount 5 instances which will prove something. I'm just saying that it's fundamentally impossible to do something to bring about a change without their support. They have to be there. And even today, when you see the common people are, on the streets when there's a protest against something, they are not all Sharmas and Guptas going on. They are people from the society. The ordinary people who do these things. So I mean, without their support, nothing is possible.
So when it comes to the kind of societal depletion that India saw under the rule of the Mughals and the other Islamic invaders, we often come to the discussion of pallus. You know how there was a concept of pallu in Hinduism, but it was optional and it was more done by queens at the time because of as a mark of respect. But it became more strict and it has become sort of integral to several cultures, especially like you said, Northwest, which became the bed or the receiving the end of all the invasions. So that there's pallus and then there's the muhurats in the North Indian weddings happening at night that also has a connection to the invaders. So what kind of societal fundamental changes did we see in order to survive under the tyrannical rule?
See, Pallu or Ghungat, which is sort of sort of an extreme form, was most likely, we have to see what is Hindu, essentially what is Hindu. if what is essentially Hindu is practiced by almost everybody across India. That something which is essential part of your religion will be practiced by everybody. You do your havans, for example. Everybody does that. Then you do Shraddh. Everybody does that. So they may not do the exact same way that, say, for example, in North India, people do observe 15 days. They might not do that, but everybody has one way of doing it. So these are the common sort of things in the thread of Hinduism. But Pallu or Ghungat is completely absent in Western and Southern India. It was very much there in Eastern India, which was later on in modern times it went away. But Southern India, it was never there and it is still not there. And so I think that this could be a mix of two things. One is sort of compulsion that you have to hide the face because the Muslim ruler is imposing sort of a face covering, and secondly, it also happens that the elite of the society, let's say that there's an Islamic rule established in a territory, and slowly the elites, they start to copy. So that could also be a reason. I'm not very sure what the exact reason were, but these are two probable causes of the tradition of Pallu. But the other thing that you asked about, the ways in which the people survived, and during my research, I've also mentioned in the book, people were so helpless. They were made so helpless that they did everything they could to survive. It was from fighting off, from killing the invaders, from living with the fact that their temples have been destroyed, pleading to the local governor to build the temple again and to do some maintenance work. They employed every possible trick in the book. I have even in Mughal times, when the taxation was so heavy that for small farmers, people who had small plots of land, it was impossible to sustain themselves if they paid the taxes. So people had even sold their children into slavery to survive. In sitting here today, we can think or comment on that act of a parent selling their child off to pay taxes. Instead of taxes, they're selling the child off. But you have no idea how those families were surviving, the conditions they were in. They probably did not have enough food to feed a family of 4 or 5 or 6. What was they supposed to do? And these children were sold into slavery. And when children are sold into slavery, the only thing that happened to boys was castration. And what happened to the girls was they were sold into households and maybe later as sex slaves or something. So, I would say that they did every possible thing to escape the tyranny. Sometimes entire villages would migrate, but that's also not possible. You can't migrate every year. You can't become nomads. So they employed every possible trick in the book to survive. And we should be thankful that our ancestors did what they did, and we sort of did not fall prey to those tyrannical rulers. We are today Hindus because our ancestors employed every single trick available to them.
So, while the interaction between the southern part of India and the Islamic invasion isn't talked much about because there's not much that really happened, but then there's often that there's discussion of Tipu Sultan and the tyranny that was seen under his rule. So, can we have you understand? Can we have you recount instances to understand the kind of relationship that the South's cultural preservation has had because of the North defending for as long as it did the Dharma. And then also talk about the tyranny of Tipu Sultan and other Mughal kings and Islamic kings that we would have seen over time.
You see, during the early invasions, the early 7th century, it was only the frontier states which sort of bore the brunt of the invasions, and we saw the establishment of Delhi Sultanate and how eventually they captured Deccan, ventured south up even up to Madurai, desecrated temples. But these were short-lived sort of dynasties, and the much of southern India was saved. Then we had the Vijayanagar Empire. There was a renaissance, Hindu renaissance, and a lot of damage was mended, and culture thrived, literature thrived, and languages thrived. So we had that insulation period thanks to Vijayanagar Empire that saved the dharma in southern India. Uh, you know, the when cultural change happens, it doesn't happen overnight. We have to have continuity. So either in today's context, if we see when we say continuity, we talk about political continuity. So a political party with an ideology lasting, say, 3 terms or 4 terms will bring social changes, because then they uh, get into academics, then they get into social fabric of the country, they mold opinions, like we saw with the Marxist historians. I mean, why did this happen? Similarly, in the medieval times, if you have a dynasty or a king who lives long enough, say 50 years, he reigns for say 40, 50 years, then he has the time and resources and the will to impact change in the society. In northern India, had that bad luck, I would say, that we saw dynasties which lasted for a longer period. There was no large scale instability in northern India. So we had very long periods of continuity, which sort of brought about changes. So we have Delhi and Agra region, for example, was almost entirely Islamized, from the elites to the people, and there were Hindus, of course, but Persian became the language of the elite, and even Hindus were composing literature in Persian and later in Urdu, which did not happen in southern India. They retained their languages, they retained their literature. So even today, when we see literature, for example, in southern India or even in western India, there is so much literature available in their languages, which in Hindi we do not. There is a there is a very strong reading tradition in every part of India, but in northern India, it's more skewed towards English these days. But in southern India, if you go, there's a lot of regional language literature, their own, they take pride in their languages. And so that is the reason they did not suffer, because Tipu Sultan was also, I would say, if you consider the history of India, he was a blip. His father and himself, there were only two people who sort of ruled, and it was a short rule. And they, of course, Tipu Sultan was a tyrant, and we read about the kind of atrocities he committed. But again, historians, Marxist historians, pick and choose. They cherry pick events to which are convenient to them. So they would say that he donated land to the temple, and he did some work here, and he donated some money to that temple. But we have to see things in a when it comes to history, we have to take a larger picture into consideration. We have to see what really happened during that time. How Tipu Sultan forcefully, converted Hindus and carried out genocide of Hindus. I mean, the large section of Kurgis still don't celebrate Diwali because it's a black day for them. So yeah, I think the southern India definitely had some advantage compared to northwestern India because of geography, if nothing else.
So, when we talk about the technological advancements and the military prowess of the Islamic invaders, and we also, like you said, that their perseverance, their sheer perseverance was one of the reasons why they were successful. Now, that can only be possible if you come from a civilization that is nomadic in nature, whether it be the kind of terrain that they came from, or it be the kind of society that they came from, or it be the kind of funds that they enjoyed from the Ottoman Empire. And as such, it was one of those, it could have only happened because of that, in my understanding. So the only reason for which we should recount the incidents of Hindu resistance is because the role of history is to learn from our mistakes. So what would be the things that we can learn about in terms of the current challenges we are facing because of the invaders, because of the invasions that we faced, because of the kind of societal narratives that we've set, and how exactly should preservation look like for us now?
See, you are absolutely right when you say that this perseverance of attack comes if you're from a nomadic society. It's very true because that's always been the case. Where the Mongols started as a nomadic tribe. They went up to Europe. What what joy did they get from attacking another continent? It's because they're nomadic people. They don't have roots. They don't have the concept of society, settled society, where you buy a plot of land, build a pakka house, and live there. They lived in tents, and they could pitch a tent anywhere. So their joy was killing, and that's what they did. But the moment they won the territories and decided to settle down, and they became part of settled societies, they again became vulnerable to the next nomad. So yes, that is true, and probably that's where this concept of offensive attacks come from. And India being a settled society, they probably never uh, thought of invading far off places. I mean, they would protect their own territories, their own people, their own resources, but they would not go out and capture new territories. But in today's context, after 1947, when India became independent, our region of the Indian subcontinent and even the larger neighborhood. So we sort of again lacked the foresight. Now, if you see the Soviet Russia, they captured these smaller countries of in Central Asia, in Eastern Europe. They brought them together into as a large sort of a country, the union of smaller countries. But and if you see India in 1947 when we got our independence, we couldn't even decide what to do with Kashmir. That the very obvious thing to do was to on 16th of August to go and put your flag there and claim the territory. But the leadership was so indecisive. I mean, of course, there were differences. Like some people had other views, and Nehru had some other view. But not considering that, as the leadership as a whole was very divided and had no clue what to do. And in the 50s, when Tibet got attacked, again, we did not have the foresight to see what's going to happen. Then there is a Bhutan, then there is a Sri Lanka, then there's a Nepal. A forward-looking country would think 50 years in advance and say, okay, I want to consolidate my borders. What should I do? I just got partitioned for religious reasons. 25% of my population doesn't like me, so they went away with a separate homeland. Now, what is there for me to do now so that my people are okay for the next 50 years? Where is the danger coming from? And we might say that today, of course, we have lot more resources, but intelligence was always available. Even in 1947, there were ways and means to find out what people were doing, what the other country was thinking. But this, I would blame that the leadership back then for not having that vision to understand what in 2024 what's going to happen, or even in 1970 what's going to happen. So they did not foresee all those things. And even say in the 71 war, when Bangladesh was created, the government did nothing to sort of sort out things which could have been. We still had the 17-kilometer long chicken's neck that could have been sort of rearranged to make it a chicken stomach, if not the entire chicken. The government did nothing. So many territories within territories existed in India, they existed in Bangladesh. There was some only later on there was some treaty which sort of the exchange happened. So we were living in sort of a fantasy land where anything was possible. So I think now it's too late, or maybe not. I don't know. There is a lot of influence of the Western countries that happen. China has grown up. They have their own say. They have their own impact. In 1947, China had very little impact on India, its economy, or even in militarily. So yes, I think the first thing to do is to secure the borders, and that is what the leadership should look at.
Thank you very much, sir. That was a very helpful session. We wish to have more such sessions with you. And the first book that you've written, I think we are impending a session on that, and I will follow you up for that. Thank you very much. Namaste.
Thank you. Namaste.